Good evening, friends. Let me open with a simple, slightly uncomfortable thought experiment. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and the world is the same planet, same gravity, same seasons, but the map is wrong. The coastlines are pushed miles outward, and the weather you consider cold is now what a mild day looks like. And on top of that, your entire wardrobe is basically a science project you have to invent with stone tools and animal parts. That's the kind of mental reset we need before we talk about how cavemen survived the last ice age, because that word is a catchy shortcut, not a real job title. And the people we're talking about were Homo sapiens with serious skills, living through what we call the last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age, roughly between about 26,000 and 20,000 years ago, with many timelines expanding the core survival crunch into the broader window of around 26,000, 19,000 years ago as ice sheets reached their widest footprint and then began to retreat. So, maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing Sydney at breakfast and Lisbon at bedtime. All at once, all of us wondering about the same mysteries. Now, the instinct in popular media is to picture a frozen wasteland, endless blizzards, one heroic hunter, and a dramatic mammoth chase. And look, mammoths are real, and the cold was real. But the real survival story is less Hollywood and more logistics. And the first logistical truth is that the planet's ice wasn't just more snow. It was a reshaping of Earth. Huge ice sheets in North America and Northern Europe, deserts expanding in some regions, forests retreating in others, and coastlines pulled outward because sea level was dramatically lower, on the order of roughly 120 to 130 meters below today at the peak, which is not a trivia detail. That is a total rewrite of where animals migrate, where humans can travel, and where resources concentrate. If you're an Ice Age group trying to survive, that sea level drop is basically a giant new shelf of land opened up around parts of the world, sometimes creating broad corridors and sometimes creating very harsh, wind-swept exposure depending on the region. The important thing for our purposes today is that the LGM wasn't one uniform experience, so we should stop thinking in a single postcard image of snowdrifts and start thinking in zones, in microregions, in local solutions. Another thing to anchor early, because it keeps the lecture honest, is that we do not have a diary from 24,000 years ago, so the story we can tell has to be built from converging lines of evidence, toolkits, animal bones with cut marks, hearths, footprints of settlement patterns, and climate proxies that show just how severe and how variable the conditions were across time and space. When you hear neat, overconfident claims like every group did X or humans survived because one genius invented Y, that's your signal to be skeptical. The best current picture is that survival during the LGM was a long, collective negotiation with risk. You could avoid the worst zones, you could move seasonally, you could specialize in certain prey, you could build better shelters and clothing, and you could widen your social networks so that a bad local year didn't become a death sentence. The stakes were high because cold doesn't just threaten comfort, it threatens calories. And that's probably the single most important theme in this entire talk. Cold is an energy tax. Your body burns more fuel just to maintain core temperature. And if your diet is inconsistent, your margin for error shrinks fast. So when we say, how did they survive? The answer is not just they warmed themselves by fire. It's they learned to live inside a full energy economy that tied together food, fuel, clothing, shelter, and social cooperation. And yes, there were brutal limits. Some regions were too glaciated or too resource poor for stable long-term occupation. And humans seemed to have clustered in what researchers often call refugia, places where local conditions, geography, and food availability created a slightly safer pocket for life, a kind of playable level in an otherwise punishing game. One last myth to clear from the table right now, because it will keep us from wandering into fantasy later. Survival wasn't a steady climb of progress, like a stairway where each step is a better tool and a happier life. It was more like a careful balancing act, with local breakthroughs, local failures, and constant adaptation. And the evidence suggests that highly capable groups could still vanish from an area if the ecology flipped or a key prey population shifted its range. That's not weakness. That's just how fragile human life is when you strip away agriculture, metal, and modern infrastructure. So the job of the next chapters is to show the real survival toolkit, piece by piece, in a way that feels concrete, the bone needle and the quiet revolution of tailored clothing, the engineering logic of mammoth bone dwellings, fire used not only for warmth but for efficiency, hunting weapons that extend human force without requiring superhero strength, dependable animals like reindeer that can provide multiple resources year after year, and the social and symbolic systems that let knowledge outlive any single person. If we get this first chapter right, the rest won't sound like cave people were tough. It will sound like the truth, which is more interesting. Ice Age humans were strategic, observant, and often surprisingly conservative in the best sense of that word, meaning they tested what worked and passed it on. Because in a world like the LGM, innovation is not about showing off, it's about not dying. Okay, so here's the part that usually surprises people, especially if their mental image of the Ice Age comes from movies or school cartoons. The most important background for human survival wasn't just ice, it was a specific ecosystem that in some regions was weirdly rich for such a cold time, what researchers call the Mammoth Steppe, or steppe tundra, a huge belt of cold, dry grassland stretching across parts of Eurasia and into Beringia. And it wasn't some lifeless white desert. It was a place that could generate serious calories if you knew how to harvest them. That last phrase matters because this chapter isn't going to pretend nature was generous just out of kindness. The Mammoth Steppe was productive in a particular way. Lots of grasses and hardy herbs adapted to cold and dryness, and that plant base supported big herds of large herbivores, including woolly mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer or caribou, and other animals that converted tough vegetation into fat, meat, hides, and bone. If you have a landscape dominated by huge plant eaters, you get two consequences that are gold for humans. First, concentrated packages of protein and fat walking around in predictable patterns. And second, a built-in supply of raw materials for tools, clothing, fuel, and shelter. That's why this isn't a side note. This is basically the pantry that makes several later chapters make sense. And just to keep us honest, let's name the obvious myth here. The idea that Ice Age people were always scraping by in constant starvation, surviving on sheer toughness alone. It's not that they never faced hunger, they absolutely did. But the existence of a high biomass ecosystem helps explain why humans could expand into high latitudes at all and maintain populations over long stretches of time. The environment wasn't stable everywhere or forever. Even within the broad Mammoth steppe zone, local conditions shifted with climate pulses, and over the long arc toward the end of the Pleistocene, this ecosystem shrank and fragmented, with big debates about how much of that change was climate-driven versus human pressure on megafauna. But during the last glacial maximum window we're focusing on, the big takeaway is pretty straightforward. In the coldest phase, some of the most important human-friendly landscapes were not forested and not wet and not lush in a modern sense, but open, windy grasslands that could sustain dense animal populations. Also, and this is a small but important correction to pop culture, mammoths were real and sometimes hunted, but they were not the only pillar of survival. In many regions, the reliable day-to-day economy likely leaned on more predictable prey, like reindeer and other mid-sized herd animals, which we'll get to later. This chapter is really about setting the logic of the Ice Age food web. The cold created constraints, sure, but it also created a kind of high-energy corridor in certain places, and humans who learned that corridor, its seasons, its herd movements, its butchery opportunities, its risks, were not just tough. They were smart managers of an extreme landscape. And that sets us up perfectly for the next step, the technology that let people actually cash in on this ecosystem without freezing to death while they did it. Let's zoom in on something small enough to fit in your palm, because sometimes that's where the survival story really lives, the eyed needle. If you've ever camped in windy cold, you already know the uncomfortable truth here, which is that having fur is not the same thing as having clothing, and Ice Age humans didn't just throw hides over their shoulders and call it a day. The archaeological record shows that eyed bone needles appear well before the last glacial maximum, with some of the earliest known examples dating to around 50,000 years ago in Siberia. And by the time the LGM hits, this technology is part of a broader toolkit that lets people build real clothing systems rather than improvised wraps. And the eyed part matters because it's the difference between poking holes and threading a controlled stitch. With an eye, you can sew hides more tightly, repair gear efficiently, and make fitted shapes that reduce heat loss at the wrists, ankles, neck, and waist. Basically all the places cold air loves to sneak in. Researchers have long treated these needles as strong indicators of tailoring and more complex dress, not just basic covering. And recent work continues to frame them as a key marker for the evolution of fitted clothing. That's not a fashion statement, that's engineering. It means layered garments. It means seams that can be positioned to block wind. It means the likely use of sinew thread and careful hide preparation. And it also means a culture of maintenance. Because in extreme cold, the difference between a worn seam and a repaired seam can literally be the difference between a workable day and a disaster. Now, I'm going to flag a myth without being too mean about it. The cartoon version of cavemen in rough pelts makes for an easy visual, but it hides the real sophistication of Ice Age life. The evidence doesn't let us reconstruct every jacket pattern or claim that every group dressed exactly the same way. We should be honest about that limit. But the presence of these needles, combined with what we know about human expansion into cold latitudes, strongly supports the idea that tailored, multi-piece clothing was part of what made long-term life in harsh northern environments feasible. So, when we talk about survival plans, this is one of the quiet keystones, not a single miracle invention, but a practical tool that suggests a whole system behind it. Skilled makers, shared techniques, probably teaching and apprenticeship, and a community that understood cold as a technical problem you could solve with planning and patience. And that sets us up for the next chapter nicely, because once you can dress for the outdoors, the next question is where you go when you come back inside and how you build a home that doesn't bleed heat all night. If the bone needle is the small, precise side of survival, then mammoth bone housing is the blunt, dramatic side, the thing you can point to and say, yeah, humans were not just passing through this landscape, they were trying to make it workable. Across parts of Eastern Europe, especially on the Russian plain and in what's now Ukraine, archaeologists have documented circular or oval structures built largely from mammoth bones, often with big pits nearby and evidence of hearths and activity areas. And some sites show multiple structures that may not all have been used at the exact same time. The famous example people love to cite is Megafauna in Ukraine, where several dwellings were found made from an impressive number of mammoth bones, and research over decades has wrestled with the big question: are we looking at true homes, seasonal winter camps, multi-use hubs, or something that blends practical living with social or symbolic meaning? The safest, honest answer is that dwelling is probably right for many of them. But the function can vary by site and by moment, and the debate is part of the story, not a flaw in it. What seems fairly consistent is the engineering logic. Big bones and tusks form a stable ring or frame, then hides likely cover or line the structure to block wind and trap heat, with the whole thing positioned in strategic landscapes near river terraces or movement corridors where herds would pass, which is a smart combination of shelter and hunting geography, rather than a random architectural flourish. And this is where I want to slow the pace a bit, because it's easy to get dazzled by the spectacle and miss the practical math of it. Wood could be scarce in these cold steppe environments, so mammoth remains weren't just food leftovers, they were structural material, and in some cases, part of the broader fuel economy too, which ties this chapter directly to the next one about fire and alternative fuels. Also, these bone buildings are not the only kind of Ice Age housing. And I don't want to accidentally imply that every group across the LGM was living in a mammoth bone ring. There were other shelter strategies, including pits, windbreaks, mixed material structures, and more temporary setups that leave a lighter archaeological footprint. So the real point of mammoth bone architecture in this lecture isn't that it was universal. It's that it shows the upper end of what Ice Age humans could coordinate when the ecology allowed it. Planning, labor, reuse of massive animal resources, and a willingness to invest in staying put long enough to justify a heavy, insulating build. In other words, this wasn't survival by desperation. This was survival by design. And it's one more reminder that the people we lazily call cavemen were capable of complex decisions about materials, energy, and risk that feels surprisingly familiar once you strip away the time distance. So after needles and shelters, we get to the thing everyone expects in an Ice Age story: fire. But I want to frame it in a less cinematic way, because the real genius here isn't humans discovered fire and lived happily ever after. That's the myth version. The accurate version is that humans already controlled fire long before the last glacial maximum, and what becomes crucial in the deep cold is how carefully and strategically you use it. When fuel can be scarce, weather is punishing, and your body is basically a furnace that needs constant feeding. Fire in the LGM is warmth, sure, but it's also a tool for turning food into more usable energy. Cooking makes many foods easier to chew and digest, and that matters when your calorie budget is tight and you can't afford to waste nutrition. And it also reduces some risks from pathogens and parasites, which is not a glamorous point, but it's a real one. Another practical layer is that fire is about light and time. It stretches the day, gives you a place to repair tools, process hides, keep children close, and maintain the social core of the group during long, dark stretches. Now here's the less obvious Ice Age detail that's easy to miss if you only picture forests and campfires. In open steppe tundra regions, wood was not always abundant, so people likely leaned on alternative fuels when needed, including bone, fat, and possibly dried dung depending on location and availability. These are not myth fuels, they're logical options in treeless or low wood environments, and experimental work and archaeological patterns have supported the idea that burning bone and fat can be part of a workable fuel strategy. The key phrase is part of, not the only fuel, because we should resist oversimplifying the story into a single clever trick. What you see instead is a flexible fuel economy, the kind that changes with season, local ecology, and what animals you're hunting. And this connects back to mammoth bone dwellings in a very grounded way. If you're processing large animals, you're not just getting meat, you're getting a whole system of resources that can be distributed across food, tools, construction, and, when it makes sense, fuel. So the big point of this chapter is that fire during the LGM functions like an economic contract with the environment. You can have heat, light, better nutrition, and a more stable daily rhythm, but you pay for that with constant fuel gathering and careful planning. And the groups who manage that balance well are the ones who can stay in harsh zones longer, move smarter, and keep their margins wide enough to survive bad weeks, not just good ones. Let's shift gears from staying warm to getting fed, because you can have the best clothing and the smartest shelter design in the world, but if your hunting strategy is clumsy, you still lose this game. And this is where the Atlatl, the spear thrower, quietly becomes one of the most important pieces of the Ice Age toolkit. The basic idea is simple enough that you can explain it to a middle school class, but the implications are huge. It's a lever that extends your arm. So when you throw a dart or light spear with an Atlatl, you can generate more speed and more force than your shoulder and elbow alone would allow, which means longer range, deeper penetration, and a safer distance from an animal that can ruin your whole week in one bad second. Now, we need to be careful with absolutist claims here, because the archaeological record doesn't let us say that every single LGM hunting group used Atlatls in the exact same way, or even that the tool was equally common everywhere. What we can say is that spear thrower technology is well established in the Upper Paleolithic toolkit and fits perfectly with the broader pattern we see in this period. Humans solving dangerous problems by adding mechanical advantage, rather than relying on brute strength. And that's the myth I want to underline clearly before it sneaks back into our heads. The idea of Ice Age hunting is mostly muscular heroics, one man versus one mammoth, is basically a modern fantasy projected backward. Real high-stakes hunting is closer to project management than gladiator combat. The Atlatl makes sense in a world where you're hunting big herd animals in open terrain, sometimes in wind, sometimes over snow, sometimes with limited cover, because it gives you standoff distance and it lets a coordinated group launch multiple projectiles quickly, which shifts the risk away from close-range chaos and toward planning, tracking, and timing. You can also imagine how this tool pairs with everything we've already discussed. Tailored clothing keeps you functional in the long cold hours spent following herds. Good shelters mean you can stage longer stays near migration corridors. Fire helps you process meat and fat efficiently. And then the Atlatl gives you a better shot at turning all that preparation into actual calories. So the survival lesson here isn't just they had a clever weapon. It's that Ice Age humans were building layered systems where one improvement locks into another. And the Atlatl is a clean example of that mindset. A small piece of wood and bone that turns knowledge, patience, and teamwork into a higher probability of coming home with food. I want to step away from the mammoth spotlight for a minute, because if we focus only on the biggest, most dramatic animal, we end up with a slightly distorted survival story. Mammoths mattered, sure, but for a lot of Ice Age groups, the real backbone may have been something less cinematic and more dependable: reindeer. And I'm using reindeer in the broad Ice Age sense here, the species and its close ecological role across northern Eurasia. Because what matters is the pattern: medium to large herd animals that are mobile, abundant in the right zones, and useful in almost every way you can imagine. Think of it like this. If mammoths are the big, high-risk, high-reward opportunity, reindeer are the steady paycheck. You don't build a long-term survival strategy around jackpot events alone. You build it around the thing you can count on year after year. And reindeer offer that kind of reliability. Meat, obviously, but then hides for clothing and bedding, sinew for thread and bindings, bones and antlers for tools. Even the planning side of it is different. Reindeer are migratory herd animals with habits that can be learned, predicted, and exploited without requiring constant suicidal close-range confrontations. If your group is trying to survive winter after winter, that matters more than a single legendary kill. Now, I'm not saying reindeer were equally central everywhere across the entire Ice Age world. That would be too tidy, and real history is rarely tidy. But in the Mammoth steppe and broader cold steppe tundra zones, reindeer fit the landscape and the human toolkit really well. And this is where you can feel how ecology and technology lock together. The Atlatl we just talked about, that kind of distance weapon, is perfectly suited to open country hunting. Tailored clothing, you need that for long tracking days in high wind and deep cold. Shelters that don't collapse into chaos when the weather turns, those become staging points along migration corridors. In other words, even a simple reindeer-focused economy is a sophisticated system once you zoom out. There's also a social side hiding in the biology. Herd animals reward collective knowledge. Your best hunter isn't only the strongest person, it's the person who knows where the animals will likely cross, when the herd is moving, how the weather shifts their route, and when you can hunt without destroying your future options. This kind of hunting encourages planning, patience, and shared decision-making. It can also encourage specialization inside a group. Someone tracks, someone butchers, someone processes hides, someone manages fire and storage. Nobody has to be a superhero. The group just has to be competent and coordinated. We should also puncture another myth here. The idea that Ice Age diets were pure meat festivals, non-stop. The reality is more pragmatic. Reindeer provide a dependable protein and fat base, but people were almost certainly opportunistic within that framework. If you've got access to smaller game, fish, seasonal plants, whatever the local ecology offers, you stack those options. Survival in the LGM wasn't a one-item menu. It was a flexible, risk-aware food strategy. And if you're thinking about what this would feel like in daily life, that's worth a moment too. A reindeer-based world is not just hunting scenes. It's hide scraping, it's careful drying and smoking, it's tool maintenance, it's seasonal scheduling. It's the constant mental calendar of when migration should happen and what it means if it doesn't. That's a quieter kind of intelligence than the movie version of prehistory, but it's probably closer to the truth. So this chapter is really about realism. If we want an educational story that stays honest, we have to accept that survival usually runs on reliable systems, not just dramatic episodes. Reindeer as a recurring, multi-purpose resource fit that logic beautifully. They help explain how communities could persist for long stretches in harsh northern environments without needing the narrative to turn every week into an epic showdown with a mammoth. And that brings us smoothly to the next layer of the story, because even in a reindeer-centered economy, people still needed a broader knowledge of the landscape, including the quieter food sources that don't have hooves. This chapter is about the foods that don't roar, don't leave giant skeletons behind, and don't look impressive on a museum poster, because one of the biggest myths about Ice Age life is that people basically lived on meat alone with the occasional dramatic kill. And the more you read the evidence, the harder that myth is to defend. We're not guessing here out of modern diet politics. We're following the archaeology, which is messy but increasingly clear in one direction. Upper Paleolithic people in several regions were processing and eating plant foods, including starchy plants, seeds, and possibly wild grasses. And sometimes they were doing it with enough intention and repeatability that we can see it in the tools. A classic example is the evidence for grinding plant material at Gravettian sites in Europe. Residues and useware on stones from places like Bilancino in Italy, dated roughly to around 25,000 years before present, suggest the production of flour from wild plants long before agriculture. And this is not presented as a cute anomaly, but as part of a broader pattern of Upper Paleolithic plant processing that shows up in multiple sites across Europe. If you zoom out, you can see why this matters for our main question. How did they survive the last ice age? Because plants are not just extra calories, they're a risk buffer. When big game is scarce, when weather interrupts hunting, when you're nursing children, or when a group is trying to stretch supplies at the tail end of winter, starchy roots and seed foods can take pressure off the all-or-nothing gamble of large animal hunting. And yes, the environment of the LGM in many northern zones was harsh and herb-dominated. But herb-dominated doesn't mean plant-free. It means the edible opportunities are different and often more seasonal. And that's a knowledge problem as much as a climate problem. This is where I want to be careful and honest. We can't pretend we have a complete shopping list of LGM plant diets for every region, because plant remains preserve poorly compared to bones, and a lot of what people used may have been processed in ways that leave faint traces. But the growing body of microfossil and residue work makes it increasingly difficult to argue that plants were irrelevant. Now, about medicinal herbs, because this is where people sometimes slide into fantasy without realizing it. We do have strong evidence from dental calculus and other lines of study in earlier Paleolithic contexts that hominins consumed a variety of plant materials, and some researchers have argued for medicinal plant use in certain cases. But for LGM-era Homo sapiens specifically, it's safer to say this as a cautious possibility rather than a confident headline. In other words, it's reasonable to think that groups who knew which plants were edible, which were toxic, and which soothed illness may also have experimented with remedies. But we should frame that as inference built on broader Paleolithic patterns, not as a proven pharmacy catalog for every Ice Age camp. Still, even without leaning hard on medicine, the core point stands. The Ice Age survival story becomes more realistic once we accept that knowledge of plants, when to gather them, how to process them, how to detoxify or grind them, how to store them, how to combine them with meat and fat, was part of the human toolkit. And that knowledge is silent in the record, not because it didn't exist, but because it's subtle, perishable, and often easier to miss than a spear point or a mammoth skull, which is exactly why we need to say it out loud in a serious educational lecture. Here's a shift in mood for a minute, because we've been talking about needles and bones and fire, all the stuff you can point to in a museum case, and now we're heading into the more human, less visible engine behind survival. Who helped whom? And why that might have mattered so much in extreme cold. The grandmother hypothesis is one of the most influential ideas in evolutionary anthropology for explaining a weird human fact. Compared with other great apes, humans have a long postmenopausal lifespan, and that's unusual enough that it needs an explanation beyond, well, people got lucky. The basic claim is simple and honestly kind of intuitive once you hear it. Older women who were no longer having children could increase the survival and reproductive success of their descendants by helping feed and care for grandchildren, which would give natural selection a reason to favor longer life after fertility ends. That framework has been developed most famously by researchers like Kristen Hawkes and colleagues, building on observations that in some hunter-gatherer contexts, older women can play a major role in provisioning and childcare, especially when moms are dealing with newborns and the practical chaos of small children close in age. Now, we should be careful with the leap from hypothesis to Ice Age certainty, because this is where educational content can get sloppy fast. We do not have direct LGM-era footage of grandmothers gathering food for toddlers, so the argument is necessarily indirect, built from life history theory, comparative primate context, modern or historic human population data, and how those patterns might map on to the Paleolithic. But indirect doesn't mean made up. Several studies in historical populations have found that the presence of a maternal grandmother is associated with improved child survival, though results can vary by lineage, ecology, and social structure. More recent large datasets also find grandmother effects on fertility patterns and birth spacing in some contexts, again with nuance and variation rather than one universal rule. So the responsible way to say this for our LGM lecture is, the grandmother hypothesis is a plausible, well-developed explanation that fits multiple lines of evidence about human life history and kin support. But we shouldn't pretend it is a single proven Ice Age law that applied identically everywhere. Not every society shows the same level of grandmothering, and some recent work on living forager groups suggests the patterns can be more complex than the clean, idealized version of the story. That complexity actually helps our Ice Age narrative because it keeps us grounded in real human variability. So what would this idea look like if we drop it into a last glacial maximum setting without romanticizing it? It probably looks like a division of labor that becomes especially valuable when the environment is punishing. Remember our energy theme. Cold is an energy tax. Kids are expensive. Pregnancy and nursing are expensive. And a group that can reduce the risk of child loss by widening the circle of caregivers has a genuine advantage. Older adults, not just grandmothers, but elders more broadly, also tend to be the keepers of local knowledge in small-scale societies, where the herds cross in a bad year, which routes are safe when the easy foods are gone, how to read early warning signs in weather, when a river ice pattern is unsafe, that kind of thing. That's hard to prove archaeologically, but it's a reasonable inference from how knowledge works in small communities. And in an LGM context, that knowledge might have been as valuable as any tool, because the margin for error was thin. One more settle point. The grandmother hypothesis also pushes back against an older, overly narrow story of human evolution that centers almost everything on male big game hunting as the main engine of family survival. It doesn't deny hunting mattered. It just argues that female foraging, intergenerational help, and shared provisioning could be equally foundational to the human pattern. For our lecture, that helps balance the picture. Ice Age survival wasn't one heroic role, it was a network of roles. So if you're building a mental image of an LGM camp, you can imagine the spear throwers and the hide workers and the fire managers, but you can also picture the older women who are still active, still skilled, still central to the daily economy, helping smooth out the dangerous moments when a mother is stretched too thin. That's not sentimental, it's strategic. And even if the exact intensity of grandmothering varied from group to group, the broader message is solid. Longevity can be a survival technology. It's not a tool you hold, it's a social advantage that lets experience, skill, and care stack over generations. And in a world that brutal, that kind of advantage is exactly the sort of thing that can quietly tip the odds in your favor. Let's be honest, this is the chapter where the movie version of the Ice Age usually runs out of imagination, because it's easier to show a spear than to show a relationship. But relationships might be the bigger story. When researchers talk about Upper Paleolithic survival networks, they're not talking about markets with stalls and prices, obviously. They're talking about the movement of material and the movement of people across surprising distances, the kind of pattern that shows up when you find stone from faraway sources or marine shells deep inland. And you have to ask, okay, how did that get here and why did it keep happening? One influential way of summarizing the evidence is that long-distance exchange in lithic raw materials and ornaments during the Upper Paleolithic could stretch to hundreds of kilometers in some contexts, which implies regular contact, or at least repeated chains of contact between groups, rather than a one-off wandering accident. And we can get more concrete than that with regional case studies. For example, work in southwestern Iberia at Valboy suggests that non-local cherts were moved roughly on the order of a couple hundred kilometers, with the authors interpreting about a 250-kilometer gap between site and source during Gravettian contexts as likely reflecting exchanges between groups near the edges of their territories. And they also argue that even as mobility patterns changed around the LGM, social contacts and access to non-local materials didn't just vanish. That sort of pattern is a big clue, because in an LGM world, your biggest enemy isn't just cold, it's local bad luck. A herd shifts its route, a river freezes differently, a storm wrecks your hunting window, and suddenly your small patch of territory is a risky place to bet your children's survival. So you widen the circle, you maintain ties, you exchange good stone, pigments, shells, maybe finished tools, maybe knowledge of distant landscapes, and you keep the door open for visiting, refuge, and mutual help. The key point is that this doesn't have to be trade in a modern economic sense to function like insurance. Gift exchange, reciprocal obligations, seasonal aggregation, and shared ritual spaces could all do the same social job. Now, the second half of this chapter title, Marital Alliances, needs careful wording because we can't excavate an engagement ceremony from 23,000 years ago, but it's a reasonable, widely discussed inference that long-distance social ties were also one way to reduce inbreeding risk and maintain social stability across sparsely populated landscapes. And when we look at broader genetic work on ancient hunter-gatherers in Eurasia, we do see evidence of changing population structure and connections across regions over time, which fits the general idea that people were not living in tiny sealed bubbles. So I'm not going to claim we can map every marriage route with certainty, but the social logic is strong. In harsh environments, you don't just need tools and calories, you need friends you can reach, you need allies you can trust, and you need a bigger social map than the valley you're standing in. This is another place where the caveman label really fails us, because what we're looking at is a human strategy that feels almost modern in its underlying principle. Diversify your risk. Invest in relationships, and don't let survival depend solely on tomorrow's hunt in your own backyard. All right, let's go into the caves, because this is where the Ice Age story often gets either romanticized or oversimplified. And we're not doing either. We're not going to pretend we've cracked a single true meaning of cave art, because scholars themselves don't agree on one master answer. And honestly, the evidence probably doesn't support a one-size-fits-all interpretation anyway. What we can say with confidence is that Upper Paleolithic cave art is real, sophisticated, and often centered on animals that were genuinely part of people's world. And the famous site that most Americans have at least heard of, Lascaux, in southwestern France, is usually placed around the Magdalenian period, with radiocarbon and contextual dating often clustering broadly around the neighborhood of roughly 17,000 years before present, though the exact internal timeline may be more complex than a single moment. Now, what was it for? This is where we have to slow down and label interpretation as interpretation. One older, influential idea is hunting magic. Basically, the thought that depicting animals was part of ritual practice aimed at increasing hunting success. That concept is historically important in the scholarship and still gets discussed, even if many researchers today treat it as only one possibility among several. Another set of explanations leans toward caves as ritual or ceremonial spaces, maybe places for initiation, storytelling, group gatherings, or symbolic identity. Not because that sounds poetic, but because the locations, the effort required, and the repeated cultural investment suggest these were not just casual doodles someone did because they were bored on a rainy day. And some recent popular syntheses highlight this multi-purpose range pretty plainly, suggesting Lascaux could have served hunting-related, social, religious, teaching, or performative functions, possibly overlapping rather than competing. What I like about calling these cave libraries isn't that it proves they were literally textbooks, but that it nudges us toward a sensible middle ground. Even if the art was ritual, it still carries observational knowledge. Even if it was social bonding, it still reflects deep attention to animal movement, anatomy, and behavior. Even if it was storytelling, stories in survival cultures are often how you store and transmit information without writing. So it's totally reasonable to imagine cave art as part of a broader memory system. Not the only one, not a replacement for day-to-day teaching, but one more way humans turned an unstable world into something a little more predictable in the mind. And that matters for our big theme, because the LGM survival toolkit isn't just physical tech like needles and spear throwers, it's cognitive and social tech too, the ability to preserve knowledge, coordinate meaning, and keep group identity strong when life is hard and the margins are thin. So I'll say it this way for the lecture. We can't prove that every bison painting was a lesson plan, but we can be confident that the people who made this art were careful observers of their prey and their seasons. And in a world that cold, that kind of shared, durable attention is not a luxury, it's part of how you stay alive. Let's bring this home in a way that doesn't turn into a motivational poster, because the Ice Age doesn't need that kind of help. If we've done our job right so far, you can already feel the main argument sitting under everything. Humans didn't survive the last Ice Age because they were magically tougher than everyone else, and not because the environment was somehow kind. They survived because they built a stack of solutions that covered different kinds of risk at the same time. Clothing that actually sealed heat. Shelters that made sense in a windy, wood-poor world. Fire used like an energy strategy, not just a vibe. Weapons that extended force. A diet that wasn't one note. Social networks that acted like insurance. And cultural systems that helped preserve knowledge. None of these things alone guarantees survival. Together, they widen the margin. Now, the thing that makes this last chapter necessary is that the climate didn't politely stabilize once people figured out how to live in the cold. It kept changing. The last Ice Age was not one frozen block of time where every decade felt the same. Even after the last glacial maximum began to ease, the climate system had plenty of room for sudden swings. The big headline example later on is the Younger Dryas, an abrupt return to colder conditions roughly around 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. That's after the LGM proper, but it matters for our story because it shows you what humans were really up against long term. Not just cold, but unpredictability. A rapid climate reversal can break a food web faster than a bad hunting season can. And that kind of event forces people to either pivot or move or shrink or connect with other groups. So when we say Ice Age survival, we're really talking about survival across waves of disruption, not just one peak. This is also where I want to correct one more myth that's sneaky because it sounds respectful. The idea that survival was mainly about individual bravery. That's still a modern story we like to tell. The evidence points instead to group-level problem solving. You don't sew layered, fitted clothing systems without knowledge passed across people and time. You don't build large, organized dwellings without planning and cooperation. You don't keep long-distance exchange ties alive without social rules, trust, and repeated contact. The Ice Age didn't reward lone wolves. It rewarded small communities that could function like flexible machines. And flexibility is the word I keep coming back to. It's almost boring compared to conquest or triumph, but it's more accurate. Flexible diets, flexible mobility, flexible social ties, flexible use of materials, even flexible storytelling. You can imagine a group that leans heavily on reindeer one stretch of time, then shifts toward other herd animals, or fish, or plants, depending on local circumstances. You can imagine seasonal movement patterns tightening or loosening based on weather and prey. You can imagine families maintaining relationships across distances so that when a region fails, there's somewhere else to go. None of these moves are dramatic in isolation. Together, they're the difference between a population that can absorb shocks and a population that can't. So what's the legacy? It's not just that we made it. It's that this period shows the early shape of something that's still true about human survival today. Our competitive advantage isn't raw strength. It's systems thinking. We're good at creating tools that imply other tools, at building social scaffolding around risk, at turning observation into shared knowledge, and at adapting when the rules change faster than we'd like. The last Ice Age is an extreme case, but it's a clean case. It's the historical laboratory where you can see the human formula without modern noise. And honestly, that's why the title of this whole lecture, How Cavemen Actually Survived the Last Ice Age, is both catchy and slightly unfair. Cavemen makes it sound simple. The real story is complex, patient, and collective. These were people with an engineering mindset, a practical relationship with the landscape, and a social intelligence that mattered as much as any spear point. They didn't beat the Ice Age by overpowering it. They survived by learning its patterns, exploiting its openings, and building a culture that could keep functioning when nature decided to change the rules mid-game. Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.